let's move on and talk about religion. It's something that is really controversial at the moment when we see Islamist attacks, extremist Islamist attacks from Boko Haram in Africa, and of course the attacks in Paris. And just over the weekend, just chatting to a few people, there seems to be a lot of sort of latent Islamophobia being slipped into conversation. Things like, well, what do you expect from Muslims? And this is seriously problematic.
I think that we think that it's just ignorant Americans who feel that way. But we actually recently were sitting in Sea Point at a restaurant with a bunch of private school girls. We all went to school together. And one of my best friends from high school, I probably shouldn't be admitting this on camera, but she just said a string of extremely Islamophobic things. I mean, I was clutching at my heart and trying not to fall off my chair. Sorry, I just hit my mic. And then you realize it's not just ignorant Americans who live in, the deep south. It's educated people who've grown up in modern times. And any generalization, any general feeling like that is harmful. It's what causes things like apartheid and any bigotry, any prejudice. It's a terrible thing.
Yeah, it worries me because I found growing up, I lived around. There were Muslims in my school. They were just it was normal for me, and there was never a distinction. I never grew up with that distinction that okay, Muslims are very, very different from us. Because they were just around and they were part of my communities. But nowadays, I'm seeing more and more that people are really othering Muslims, and but they've always been part of our communities. Why all of a sudden are we terrified of them for no good reason? And it's as though if Christians, in 1995, there was the Srebrenica massacre. 8,000 Muslims were killed, but nobody ever said, oh, well, the Christians are dangerous, you need to watch out for them. It's what you must expect from Christians. I don't know why does that we're choosing to really hate on Muslims just based on the actions of few extreme groups. It's totally not fit.
Well, it happened more recently in the Central African Republic. We had a Christian militia killing Muslims, but it's not reported on.
No.
And that's the problem. We need to look at the way we're reporting on these stories.
Well, I mean, anything in Africa is not as widely reported as things in Europe and America. We've seen that now with Boko Haram versus the Paris attacks. But also you have to look at who controls the media.
Yeah.
If you look at the people, the American media, who's it controlled by? It's certainly not controlled by minorities. And I think that's why that happens. But there's a post circulating on Facebook that started coming up again with the Paris attacks that says, if you don't say all Christians and refer to the KKK, why do you say all Muslims and refer to terrorists? It's the exact same thing, but we just choose to have that prejudice against some religions and not others. And it's a harmful, terrible thing, and it makes everything worse all the time.
It is heartening, though, that there's a lot of fight back. There's blowback against that kind of this trend of all Muslims, all Muslims. People are standing up saying, no, not all Muslims. This is rubbish. You can't conflict an entire billions and billions of people across the world, but based on the actions of a few extreme people who do some terrible things. Granted, but it's not every single Muslim person out there.
The I'll Sit With You campaign, that was just
Wasn't that
beautiful to
fantastic?
see.
Yes,
it was
that was
really
wonderful,
amazing.
yeah.
I mean, I grew up in a small town in Mpumalanga, and Catholics were evil, basically. I mean, anything that wasn't NG Kerk was bad. I mean, I don't even think I knew about Muslims till I got to high school and learned about sex at the same time. It was a very enlightening year, 2002.
If only we could have been a fly on the wall.
No, really, I don't even think I knew about Jews or Muslims. I'm not even joking. I knew NG Kerk, and then I knew that the Catholics were bad.
A little bit worrying. But this is how a lot of South Africans are being raised and are growing up. I wanted to speak to you guys about Charlie Hebdo and their decision then to publish an image of the Prophet Muhammad after the attacks with the sign Je suis Charlie, and basically saying that they forgive, but choosing to depict the Prophet. Now, we know that it is well within their rights, but your opinions on whether they should have done it, Lisa?
Gosh, it's a tough one because I will always stand for freedom of speech, but I do see that it is offensive. And it's that grey area of, I don't agree with what you're saying, but I think you should be allowed to say it. The same thing as the spear, that painting. I think it is disrespectful, and I think that you shouldn't do that towards your leader. I thought it was disrespectful, but I also don't think that the outcry and the response was appropriate at all. So it's a tough one. Should they have done that? I mean, I don't really know what other route there would be that wouldn't sort of seem like a surrender. I think they needed to, maybe they felt like they needed to stand their ground in some way, but it's risky, and a lot of people, I think, will tell them they're asking for trouble.
I've steered clear of like talking about the Charlie Hebdo
Well, not
issue
now.
here. Because it's very, very like tricky. Like Lisa said, of course you have the right to publish and say anything as long as it's not hate speech or anything like that. You have the right, and I defend your right to do it. But at the same time, my issue with Charlie Hebdo, I remember when the shooting happened. It's like this Charlie Hebdo thing. The name sounds familiar, and I couldn't remember exactly what it was. And then I remembered I'd seen some of their past issues before, and I'd heard stuff about it. And from my view, as much as the people will say like Charlie Hebdo, it lampoons everyone in France, from Catholics to the Pope. Everyone gets lampooned, including Muslims. But my problem is that when lampooning Muslims, particularly in France, where there's a lot of Islamophobia in France and Europe, across Europe, you're coming from a position of power and you're picking on somebody who doesn't have as much power as you. Which is why I was never like, I was obviously against the entire shooting, but I never tweeted or said anything about Je suis Charlie, because I'm not. I do not identify with that magazine. What happened to them was terrible, but I don't identify with what that magazine is doing. I think that is wrong. As to whether should they have published the Prophet Muhammad after the fact, again, it's because of what had happened. I think in this instance, I would say, yeah, they were right to do so, just to say, look, we're still standing. But at the same time, I still don't like the magazine, but I think it was a measured and a fine response.
And I think another problem, because France has been intolerant of religion for a long time. They're not pro-religion, any religion.
Yeah.
If you are a Christian in France, you are not cool. But it's much easier to spot Muslims than Christians. You can't automatically point someone out walking down the street being Christians. So there's a big difference, because that group is very definitely alienated. They're singled out, and they are the vast minority. So you're picking on a different group of people. It's not the same thing. And my other problem with the magazine, as much as I defend their right to do what they're doing, they do sometimes border on
Racist caricatures.
Racism, and that's not right. You know, that's no longer satirical. That's offensive. That's just plain prejudice, and that I don't agree with.
In fact, there was a tweet circulating that I thought summed everything up beautifully, and the man said that he's not Charlie, he's actually Ahmed, the security guard who was shot, because even though that magazine ridiculed his culture and his faith, look, we don't know if he was a practicing Muslim, but his culture at least, he died protecting their right to do so. I think as South Africans, we can appreciate that more than Europeans, because we understand this fine balance between rights and responsibilities, although we don't always get it right.
And we also understand what it's like not to have freedom of speech.
Yeah. It was very recent in our history that we didn't have freedom of speech.
Very. So I think that there are many things that we can relate to better than a lot of people can.
Now, South African publications obviously chose not to show that image after the shooting. Did we make the right decision then?
I think so.
I agree. I don't think it's close enough to home to have to show that.
Yeah. I think, and we got to remember, at least we're trying to be more, we try to be more inclusive, we try to be more respectful of people's views. And what are you going to gain by showing the picture of the Prophet? All you're doing is you're just making a whole bunch of people upset, and you're hurting them. And like, what news value is there?
Yeah.
We know that they published a picture of the Prophet, a cartoon of the Prophet Muhammad, but what are you gaining by actually republishing it in your magazine or newspaper?
I don't think we needed to include it to report on it accurately.
No.